Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Our first is no stranger at all, in fact neither are strangers at all to the Faraday Institute, and this is Allan Chapman, who is lecturing in the Department of Modern History in Oxford, who's just rushing around at the moment, I know, and doing a huge amount of lecturing. Has done quite a lot of television lecturing as well, and so on. And so I think, I don't know how many times he's been here now, over to our Faraday Institute, but it includes seminars and other activities that we have. Alan's based at Wadham College, Oxford, which was founded in 1610. So it's just had its 400th anniversary, one of the younger Oxford colleges, I think, and stemming from the Reformation. So we're very pleased that Alan's going to speak to us today on a rather long title, Science, Secularism and Enlightenment, the Historical Origins of a Modern Mythology. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much indeed, Dennis. Thank you very much. Well, it's an enormous pleasure to be here now. I'm sounding booming.
Zoe's just adjusting. Keep talking and Zoe will adjust it.
Let me turn it down. No, just inside my own head. There we are.
Not just in your head.
There we are. No. And I'll also take my coat off if I may. Yes, it's slightly on the warm side.
Slightly.
Thank you.
Actually loud, yes. So, yeah.
It's an enormous pleasure to be back. I should have been here in September last year, but couldn't do that because I had to have an operation on my palate, which is property, okay. And that was rapid recovery. I could have even done it then, but I couldn't really do the public transport journey. I love the Faraday. It's a wonderful institution, and I have to say this, Oxford man as I am, I wish we had something like it in Oxford. Plainly and simply, I simply wish there was something like it in Oxford. Now, I'm talking on perhaps a rather provocative subject, on certainly a revisionist one. In other words, the idea that overgoes and challenges a lot of truisms, so-called, about the way we think about the past, science and religion. Now, when I was an undergraduate, and before I was an undergraduate, and I was reading books as a teenager, and reading Life at Galileo when I was about 9, or Child's Book, that kind of thing, I simply took hook, line and sinker, a standard series of assumptions about the rise of science, what of course Richard Dawkins called ascending Mount Improbable, or what I would say by Dawkins, perhaps ascending it by Mount Impossible, but that's another story. These were the ideas we had. In the ancient world, science flourished under paganism. Everybody was free and happy to worship their gods and do experiments and cut things up, and it was jolly, jolly, jolly. Christianity came along. Stopped you that men with crosses and sharp sticks were knocking you down. Right through the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the barbarous times as they came to be called later. If you had an interest in science or freedom of speech, you'd be locked up, burned, punished, whatever. Then comes the Renaissance. Then, of course, a sort of last gasp of this is Bruno. Bruno, who dare say, I am a Copernican, and psst, up he goes in Rome in February 1600. Then Galileo, who says, but it does move, and was punished accordingly. Then comes the Enlightenment, sweetness and light. The church is finally whipped into a corner. And at last, old pagan freedom begins to reburst. And then the real death blow, the sort of Georgian the Dragon blow, was struck on the 30th of June 1860 in the other place. When young T.H. Huxley, 35 years old, destroys Sophie Sam Wilberforce, the last dinosaur of clerical reaction, to let Darwinism free and open into the world. And thank goodness that happened, because without that we would have still been under the shackles of the church and ignorance and so on. I accepted that when I was younger. It was in all the literature. And it was the normal way of thinking. I later came to be a bit suspicious of it, because I came to realize that some of the proponents of it in more recent times had been Marxists and neo-Marxists, and frankly I've never ever been enamoured to Marxism, and knowing that the whole style of thinking within Marxism was not the way. I thought, well, hang on, this progressivism towards the new and the wonderful, from the backward and the primitive, smells a bit to me. And so in consequence I started to look into things more. And I started to be struck by odd incongruities. Why is it that if the Middle Ages were so barbaric and backward in science, how do you have people like Roger Bacon, who'd done fundamental work on the rainbow and on geometrical optics as a monk in the other place? Also too, what about the great universities of Europe? Padua, Montpellier, Paris, and so on, Bologna, who pioneered the dissecting of the dead. For they understand this is not in the Renaissance. People like Hugo of Lucca and so on are 13th century. The granting of the whole structure of modern medicine, the MD degree, the MB degree, the training of physicians from an empirical study of the ancients and of corpses on the table. Hang on, where does that fit in? Then I encountered people like Nicholas of Cusa, coming up with ideas about, would it be easier for God to turn just the earth than to turn the entire universe around a stationary earth? And I thought, oh, these men must have run into serious trouble. Well, actually, Nicholas of Cusa was a cardinal. Thomas Bradwardine, who talked openly about infinity and touched upon concepts which later were touched upon via quantum and relativity physics, died as Archbishop of Canterbury. Yes, it's true that Bacon got into trouble, but not for any religious thing, or at least not for science and religious things, for fishing in the deep and murky waters of papal politics and imperial politics. And somehow I started a bit challenging this. And the more and more I looked at it, and the more I read, and the more I tried to get back to original materials, the more I came to be impressed by one screamingly obvious point. People in the last 150 years or so, 200 let's say at the most, have taken the history of science and religion and its relationship, or more correctly, science and Christianity and its relationship, and re-slewed the whole thing around to have a progression to Mount Improbable, from the darkness to the light, and so on. And that strikes me very, very strongly as massive selectivity, a gross abuse to historical evidence, and what seems to be agendas driven by Marxism, secularism, anti-Christianity, where anything, and of course science being by them shackled up naturally to progress, and hence sociological progress, sociological theory, Max Weber's ideas, all form one sort of nice hasty pudding, as it were. And as a result of that, anything to do with belief, the transcendence, and certainly Christianity, you have to put on the black side of human experience. What I want to do this afternoon is look at some, what I call cautionnaire in this process, and become increasingly fascinated in exploring the way in which these myths arose and what they state. And let me also say, this last, well, good better than the last academic year, Michaelmas term and Hilary, autumn and spring, winter, this term, I and Catherine might have read some of these in Oxford Magazine, a series of exchanges of letters in an academic magazine in Oxford, the Oxford Magazine, about the Enlightenment, with a gentleman who had the idea that the Enlightenment was just a liberating force of the world, and, well, it's very, very fun. Let's put it this way. It was he who shot the correspondence down, but that's another story. Where, therefore, do we start with this mythology? Now, I've mentioned this before, once here, but I'll recapitulate one small point, because it might have been a different audience, or different bodies of people. I think a lot of the damage done to our understanding of the immense richness and freedom of medieval intellectual culture has a lot to do with the Reformation. The Reformers were very, very keen to discredit anything medieval. And Robert Hooke himself, my dearly beloved biographical victim, on whose life I've written extensively and published extensively, made a TV program about him. He delivered a lecture to the Royal Society, never published, it's in manuscript in the Royal Society, in 1689. he speaks of the progress of science in his lifetime, by which stage he would then have been, would have been about nearly 60. And he says, in those dark and monkish times, notice, dark and monkish times, the Middle Ages, there was hardly any science. So only one or two, Roger Bacon, Pacificus, Archdeacon of Verona, who around 1000 invented a very, very early form of clock, probably a water clock, and one or two others. And also to use monkish and dark, and also it doesn't use the word medieval, that was not in use at that time, but these were in the dark and barbarous times, as he puts it. Not the flowering of medieval culture, the dark and barbarous times. Now, he was the son of a clergyman. He was a close friend of numerous bishops, Anglican bishops of his day. One of his best chums, when he became Archbishop of Canterbury, gave Robert Hooke a Lambeth MD. And so his connection with the clerical establishment, from his done as a vicar and everything, onwards with major high-ranking clerical friends, is intimate. He would have had his pulse easily on the general sense, his finger on the pulse of clerical thinking about what is now the past and so on. And what he epitomizes is what the backwardness of the Middle Ages and the glorious light of the new experimental philosophy, which was undoubtedly making great progress in his own day. Now, when of course you bear in mind that this to some degree is generated within Protestantism, and especially too to certain what you might call the more far ends of Protestantism, which were concerned with the idea that you'd had the ancient world, you'd had the gospel, you'd had the revelation and the light of Christ and the early church, then you'd had the Dark Ages, and then we the Reformers, Wycliffe, Luther, and Husserl and Calvin, were something of clearing away the mist and short-circuiting the thousands of odd years, and were then back to the light. That, I think, does a lot to discredit the idea of medieval civilization. And so that's one of my suggestions. So oddly enough, it's Christians vilifying fellow Christians at this period. Also, I'm fascinated by the use of terminology. Where do words like atheist come from, and where they're used? Well, I've had a lot of thinking about this at the moment. I'll tell you why. Because BBC 4, Chet TV, have been approaching me at the possibility of a programme on the history of science and religious faith. We've had a lot of dialogue with the people who do it. Whether they'll finally let me loose with it's another story. That might be too dangerous for their thinking, but that's another story. And I said that you have to bear in mind the word atheist was used widely in the 17th century, but never in relationship to science. It was used to biblical skeptics, the kind of people who ask this sort of question. Where did the women come from who married the sons of Adam and Eve? And questions of that kind. Where did the men come from who married the daughters of Lot after the destruction of the world at Sodom and Gomorrah? These would be atheists. They were not accepting the faith. It was also used very frequently too against people who disagreed with your style of Christian thinking. You come across English Protestants who speak of papist atheists because they follow Antichrist, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. They are therefore atheist. They are against the true faith that comes through the Reformers. And this badinage, and it also is used much more humorously against rogues and loose livers. Somebody who's caught the pox, who is never sober, has killed a man and is in permanent trouble, or is an atheist. As which is against drunks, thugs, Catholics, biblical skeptics. They have never found it against scientific principles in the 17th century. And so we have to bear in mind the antiquity of the term, which is probably 16th century as a term, as not of scientific application until much, much, much more recent times. Now, also in addition to that, let's say something about some of the great, as it were, crashes that supposedly took place. Let's start with Giordano Bruno. We are always told, and they will always, you read a more popular history of science, the histories of science which I describe as belonging to the Enid Blyton school of the history of science. And you will get the Mount Improbable story. Here we have Giordano Bruno, burned in Rome on the Campus Martius in February 1600. He was a Copernican. They never asked a more important question. Why did nobody burn Copernicus 70-odd years before? Why did nobody burn Osiander and Rheticus, who published the original Narratio Prima, that published the Copernican theory several years before Copernicus published? Nothing secret about what Copernicus was doing. It's all known across learned Europe. Well, they've never been burnt. So let's keep to Bruno. When you look at Bruno's life, you can fully understand why he got burnt. He was born in 1548 in Naples, very comfortably off family. He entered the Dominican order as a friar. He became a friar, an intellectual Catholic to try to catch back the fallen in Europe, especially the Protestants. By the very nature of being a Dominican, he travels. But instead of bringing people back into the faith, he loses his own. He starts getting very interested in certain forms of Protestantism. Naughty, naughty, if you are a Dominican monk. Far worse than that, he becomes fascinated by classical paganism. And he gets to a situation where Jesus is no more than just a teacher, where the incarnation, the resurrection, and so on, are at the same level as Aesop's fables, where the whole idea of divine transcendence is about a world soul. We are all part of one big world soul. And of course, needless to say, not only does it involve the denial of Christ and the whole apparatus of Christianity, it means the Pope is absolutely a charlatan. Now, if you are an Italian Dominican and you're coming out with that, they'll set fire to you no matter what you believe about cosmology. And the fact that he happened to be also a Copernican, not because he admired Copernicus as such, his connection to heliocentrism was drawn much more from Pythagorean mysticism. Pythagoras' idea of a central sun, a central lamp to the universe, around which everything rotated. So we have this myth that somehow he is a victim of church persecution. Yes, I admit, he was a naughty boy, and the church would get him. Yes, nowadays we don't burn people, we just deprive them of their research grants, make them unemployable, and things of that sort. Much more humane nowadays. If you don't global warming or anything like that, you're not quite set fire to them. But what happens with him is the fact that he simply doesn't play the rules of the society he lives in. And when you don't play the rules of the society you live in, you get into trouble. In 1600, that includes stacks of wood and matches. So let's bear that in mind. It has nothing to do with science in any serious degree. Galileo, the other one that's always trotted out. What again people will tell you about the Galileo myth? It's stagnant, I see it moves and so on. All comes so much later. Much more translated to us through Bertolt Brecht's The Trial of Galileo than it is some really solid history. What they don't tell you is this. Galileo himself was actually a quite straight, orthodox Roman Catholic. He was devout by the standards of the day. He certainly makes no utterances of an atheistical or skeptical nature. And just to prove his bona fides, as it were, he has a lot of close chums right up there in the Catholic hierarchy. How does he get his book published in 1632? Dialogue concerning the two chief systems of the world. Well, his very good old friend, formerly Cardinal Matteo Barberini, now elevated to Pope Urban VIII. And a close friend, Galileo has the right to go in the Vatican and have a chat with the Pope. He's on such close terms with the Pope, his old patron and his old friend. And Galileo had been told not to publish the Copernican theory as truth in 1616 by Robert Dallamini, one of the great intellectual cardinals of the late 16th, early 17th century. Dallamini died shortly afterwards at a great age. But why, in fact, was he told not to teach the Copernican theory? For one very good reason, that we would all completely support. He couldn't prove it. He could put it forward as a conjecture, as a philosophical idea, yes, but not hard and fast, especially using Galileo's favourite style of argument, the abuse of his rivals. Translate some of the words which Galileo has in that dialogue into English, and those who don't follow the Copernican system are asses, simpletons, fools, idiotes, idiots. And of course the very man he has in his dialogue to argue against the Copernican theory. He steals the name of a dead Greek scholar of 1,000 years earlier, Simplicio, which of course means just what we would take it to be as well. Galileo's dialogue on the two chief systems of the earth is heavily loaded, in fact, against anybody who disagrees with his position. But the thing is, he can't prove the earth rotates. You cannot measure a stellar parallax in 1600, or you wouldn't measure one properly till 1838, because the angle is so tiny. The angle corresponding to approximately the diameter of a 10p piece at 7 miles. You couldn't remotely measure that with the wood and brass naked eye instruments of the 17th century. So yes, Copernicus had predicted a stellar parallax, a rock on a star position, as a proof, but nobody could observe it. And bear in mind, in pre-Newtonian physics, even almost pre-Keplerian physics, where Galileo is writing, Galileo never takes much on board of Kepler. He also ignores a number of key, obvious facts. He hates and attacks the Aristotelians in the Italian universities. And what do the Aristotelians argue against Galileo? If Mr. Copernicus was correct and the earth was spinning, we'd all be flung off. Likewise, we would have a permanent wind blowing out of the east as the earth flew through space, or our atmosphere might be ripped away. Very, very importantly, go to the top of the tower, drop a brick off the tower, and it always falls bang to the bottom of the tower. If the earth was moving, the bottom of the tower would have moved a bit, and the brick would never have hit the bottom of the tower. It would be a few feet away. These are all good observations which you could do in 1610. Galileo ignores them. Galileo's writing of the dialogue is also so utterly value-laden, he fails to mention that there should really be 3 chief systems of the world. The third one he doesn't mention because it completely scoffers his argument. The theory ethicobrae, first published in Europe in 1586, 60-odd years before. Tycho had said this, and Tycho was the finest observational astronomer in Europe before Flamsteed and Huygens and Cassini a century later, with massive revolutionary instrumentation. What Tycho had said was this, is that if you have the sun in the middle of the universe, well, you should have a parallax. I've got the most accurate instruments that the world has ever known, and I can't see one. So as a good scientist, I abandon that theory. But I suggest this, because Galileo and also too Copernicus have a few interesting points. Why are all the planetary retrogrades in direct relationship to the terrestrial year? Why is it that Mars has 2 retrogrades, Jupiter has 12, Saturn has just under 30? All of which are multiples of the terrestrial year. Why is it that the inner planets have no retrogrades? Because they're probably going faster than we are. Now Tycho knows this. Tycho approaches the Copernican theory at a time when Galileo was still a toddler and does minute analysis and measurement into it. And he comes up with this theory, published in 1586. The Earth is in the middle of the universe. The sun goes around the Earth. And all the planets go around the sun. It's the Copernican system just with a pin stuck through a different planet. And that explains so much of the phenomenon that Galileo rants about in the dialogue. And he utterly and completely ignores it. The great third system of the earth, which Galileo utterly should have taken on board as a fair-minded scientist, he completely ignores. The Jesuit scientists in Rome, the papal scientists, we've got Christopher Clavius and so on in Rome, the great telescopic astronomers of the Jesuit order, knew this. And they know Galileo is twisting the evidence. That's what also helped to get him into trouble. Plus the fact that Galileo never lacked enemies. When you go through your career calling your rivals simpletons, idiots, dolts, donkeys, things of that sort, when you don't win friends, it influences people. And Galileo was working in the culture of a Renaissance Italian court. The Vatican was a court, just like the court of Charles I in England, or of Louis XIII in France, or of Frederick the Holy Roman Emperor, or Philip of Spain, or any of these. And the court rotated on its own son, the king, the monarch, or the pope. And as soon as you had started to say something or do something wrong, and you started to slide, and your credibility had been damaged, nobody dared help you. Because all of their careers would be on the slope as well. They could rise with you, yes, but once you got up there and you'd blotted your copybook, hang on, you crash on your own. This is one of the reasons why Galileo got into trouble. Abuse of an old friend, a whole structure of the politics of his day, writing a grossly biased argument that missed major arguments against him, and being abusive to all manner of people. But on the other hand, Galileo, there's no evidence that he ever said, you know, it does move and all. And like so many people, I was coloured in my thinking as a boy by 19th century French romantic paintings of the noble Galileo standing before these judges. On the other hand, we all know the Galileo we love. The old man with the beard, the sunken eyes, so exhausted, so worn out by persecution. Check on the website, Pictures of Galileo. There is in there, and I know the original, in the National Maritime Museum, probably the youngest picture of Galileo. Galileo at 40, 45, just the same age when he's making his great discoveries, 1610 with the telescope. And believe me, that face, when my wife first saw that, she said, I wouldn't like to meet him on a dark night. He's wearing a black velvet doublet and very nicely trimmed little collar. Very close cropped black hair. He's in this sort of pose. And he has a facial look which was... and he doesn't look what you would call a jolly bunny. And that's the Galileo that gets into trouble. Not the old white-bearded man of legend. 30 years into the future, the Galileo in his 40s, not in his 70s. We only remember the pictures from his 40s, from his 70s. Bearing in mind, portraits are tremendous indicators of states of mind. And I study portraits, I collect portraits of scientists, theologians, all sorts of people. But also, too, what did happen to Galileo when he'd been released by the Vatican, without being tortured or ripped apart or anything horrible like that? Well, Asciano Piccolomini, Archbishop of Siena, who rather liked him, invited him to Siena for a holiday. Now, hang on, I thought the church had just condemned him, but you've got a high-profile archbishop inviting him for a bit of a break. Another thing we often forget too in that world, the Catholic Church was not one single unity. There were lots of Catholic churches. You ask a German cardinal, what do you thought about the Catholicity of a Spanish cardinal? Or a French cardinal, who, especially if you're a German cardinal, or an Italian cardinal, and you would have the claws coming out. And you've got to bear in mind, instead of this popular image we have of the great monolithic Catholic Church stamping on anybody who says, please sir, I don't agree with that, is itself an illusion. Now, one piece of information I didn't know last time I was at the Founder, and this came to me in Christchurch, which was both Rodney and I share very, very closely together. Ronald Truman, a history don in Christchurch, and of course you know Ronald very well. And this is about a year old, 2 years ago in summer. And I was into Christchurch one afternoon for tea, and Ronald was in, and phew, a lot nicer than it is here than it was in Madrid yesterday. He is, of course, an early modern historian, not a historian of science, but he's especially a historian of the Iberian Peninsula in the Renaissance. And he said, yes, I've just been, I think it was 2 weeks in Madrid working on the archives. Then he said, you know, they brought me a misfiled packet of papers. And it was the papal nuncio's letter to the Spanish Inquisition telling them to condemn Galileo in Spain. And they wouldn't do it. The Spanish Inquisition wouldn't ban Galileo. Why? Not because they were Copernicans or liberally minded, not in the least bit. We are not having those damned Italians telling we condemn who we like. We're not those damned Italians telling us who we condemn. And you know, there was an incident where Borgia, one of the many latter Borgias of high Spanish connection, was having a row with, I think it was Urban, and actually he slapped the Pope. Now, this puts a slightly different light. Galileo not being condemned, Galileo being invited to a holiday, so therefore where is this monolithic condemnation? Look at the Galileo incident, and it's a far, far, far murkier one. It's much more to do with Renaissance Italian politics than it has with astronomy. And it ain't about science at all. It's about authority, and bearing in mind, Galileo was a good Catholic. Yes, he had 3 illegitimate kids, there's no problem about that, we don't count that in. But on the other hand, he was never brought into trouble for belief in any of the major elements of faith. The incarnation, the resurrection, any of these things. And so therefore Galileo is not a religious deviant. Unlike Bruno, who was a starred A religious deviant. I have suggested that if you bear in mind that heresy in the medieval and the later church was a crime, it's rather like saying a parking ticket is a crime in English law, so is mass murder. So they're both crimes. My suggestion is that Galileo's crime was the parking ticket variety of crime, as opposed to the mass murder variety of crime. But first of all, heresy was used for both. We tend to assume that they all mean the same thing. Catholic thinking was vastly more sophisticated than we give it credit for. And I'm not a Roman Catholic. I'm an Anglican myself, but I greatly respect their tradition. Let's jump forward a bit and look at the Enlightenment. Now this is where I've been having real fun in the Oxford magazine. Let me tell you how this ball started running. A chap called Jim Reed in the Queen's College in Oxford, and there's a Queen's here as well, wrote in about, in fact, a radio discussion which had taken place 60 or 50 years before, in 1960, and was saying about how this indicated that clearly Sir Richard Southern, who was defending the church, was utterly out of touch and all the rest of it. And very, very obvious. And then, of course, after saying this, Reed then goes on to say about, thank goodness they were out of the grips of the church. And now we create secular values and human rights and all of these. Thank God for that. Then I sent about, I think about a 1,200-word letter to the magazine. I snapped it. Tim Horder, who was the editor, who is himself not a believer, but is a good journalist. He's actually a medic, but he's a good journalist, and he loves fun and games in the magazine. I'll say that for him. He said I can print whatever I like, so we had some fun. What did I start to say? I quite accept the idea about the Enlightenment as a change of style of thinking in Europe in the 18th century, or the 17th. But what actually does it amount to in real terms? the science being done in Bologna, Paris, Montpellier in 1700 is no worse than the science being done in Leiden or Edinburgh. Likewise, of course, too. Quaker scientists very often were corresponding with Catholic scientists. The idea that somehow the church suppressed science, and those places that were non-believing, and of course you'd have to think of sort of salons in France, it doesn't work. You have Calvinist scientists, Catholic scientists, Anglican scientists, Presbyterian scientists, who have an astonishing close friendship. So my argument was therefore that the Enlightenment did not improve science by the removal of religious prohibitions. Likewise, I said, another thing of great interest to me, look at the fellowship lists of the Royal Society. To its foundation, for centuries, virtually the late Victorian period, reverend gentlemen are everywhere. In Wadham, where the Royal Society was founded initially, the Oxford Experimental Club in the 1650s, we have 4 beautiful portraits in Hall. And these are 4 of the great founders of the Royal Society. Thomas Spratt, Thomas Willis, I may say was a former Emmanuel man here, and John Wilkins, all resplendent in lawn sleeves as bishops. And also Willis wearing the arms of the Garter. He was chaplain to the Garter, as well as being Bishop of Serra. There's only one secular there who's not a clergyman, Sir Christopher Wren. Christopher Wren, son of the Dean of Windsor. He would have known Charles and Henrietta Maria as a little boy at state visits to Windsor. His uncle Matthew, imprisoned by the Puritans for his staunch high church Laudian views. Wren himself marries a clergyman's daughter, Faith Coghill. And he himself, like his great bosom chum, Robert Hooke, moves emulously amongst, in his generation, 1660s, 70s, 80s, high-ranking dignitaries of the Church of England. Now, hang on, where is this Royal Society and unbelief coming from? Carry it through to the 19th century. I pointed out also too, look at the founding of the science of geology. We're always taught, yes, on the 28th of November 1859, when Origin was printed, the world had a cleavage plane that broke apart, and everyone, the world was not created on the 4 o'clock in the morning on the 4004 BC. Oh dear, absolute buckram. The idea of an ancient Earth had been around for a very long time, from the strata. And what social group had done far, far, far more to pioneer that style of thinking? Reverend gentlemen of the Church of England, and a smaller number of Free Church and Roman Catholic clergy. Now, when one looks at this whole idea of these men active, here in Cambridge and in Oxford were 2 very, very massively influential great teachers. Adam Sedgwick in Trinity here, Woodwardian Professor of Geology, and a newly created chair in Oxford, Canon Professor of Geology, William Buckland at Christchurch. Both of these men were powerful, charismatic lecturers, tremendous communicators, great field geologists, pioneered geology. They were both between them teaching in each university for, roll it all together, 80 years, probably. If you put both of their, if you think student generations, now how many young men must have sat in their voluntary classes? You never took geology as a subject, it wasn't on the cards. You took an art degree in either Oxford or Cambridge. But these were laid on. And maybe a little bit like today, you join the cricket club or the Tilly Society or something like that. And you'd go along, and one of the reasons why Buckland and Sedgwick sections were so popular, they often included field trips, teach you how to dig, how to get fossils out of the ground, how to interpret them. And both men were big, larger-than-life personalities. Both were associated as well with that newly founded institution, the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Every year, these men will be at the BAAS meetings, holding forth. There's a famous account when it met, I think, at Tynemouth or Newcastle, at about 18, in the early days of the Romans, about 1850, and they had a great, massive outing to see the geology around Wicklow Bay and Tynemouth and that area. And the famous story of Sedgwick, always in his gown, he was out of Oxford or Cambridge, with his walking stick, standing on this headland, delivering a dramatic address, just like an actor on a stage, about these ancient, pre-deluge beasts. And that was not just to students, that's to anybody who went along. Now, when you think the undergraduates in Oxford and Cambridge, the people who went to these lectures around the country, you must have had thousands and thousands of people who were what you might broadly call geologically aware. Not only that, Oxford and Cambridge people who would occupy major positions in life. Country vicars, judges, cathedral dignitaries, colonial administrators, civil servants, eminent members in the medical profession, the bar, you name it. You have a very, very major number of eminent men who know all about the age of the earth and the vast antiquity of the planet. And one of the men who attends Sedgwick lectures here in Cambridge is little Charlie Darwin. So the idea, therefore, that this was shock horror new in 1859 goes back another half century. Buckland starts teaching in Oxford about 1808, 1809. Sedgwick a bit later, but Sedgwick lives longer, and Sedgwick is still teaching into the 1860s. So therefore the idea that somehow or other geology was a product of secularism is simply not true. Now it's true that these men had this scenario for the age of the earth. There was the creation out of what they called the ancient chalk, or the ancient shock in Genesis. Then there were all the ages and the catastrophes and so on. But then there was the preparation of the world for Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve, yes, were about 4004 BC. But even when Darwin publishes, many Anglican clergymen are quite easy to see that, well, if God has made us through this great process over the centuries before humans, and we were part of this process, is not evolution reconcilable with this way of thinking? Charles Kinsey, author of The Water Babies, himself a Dorset country clergyman, is struck by Darwin. I think it's a marvellous idea. You have a whole number of Anglican clergy, and also too Asa Gray, professor of zoology at Harvard, one of Darwin's closest correspondents and friends overseas, and he is greatly smitten by Darwin's thinking. And what, of course, is Asa Gray? You don't normally find this much from his stuff about him, but look really him up. He was a very serious, I think, Congregationalist elder in Boston, a deep, sincere Christian gentleman. He was not some atheist in the wings. So therefore that's another thing where we tend to get it wrong, that one of the many things that comes out of the Enlightenment is geology, and the freedom of the ancient world. Always smell rats when you hear that way of thinking, nothing wrong. But also too, what I really, in this lovely, juicy correspondence I have, I said, when you look, did the Enlightenment really transform the human condition? Or was it something else? I said the Enlightenment people were very, very good for holding forth in elite salons, talking about abstract principles, the human condition, the rights of man, freedom, all of these wonderful things. But as it was sometimes said about them, they did it when the servants had gone to bed. Not too much talking about freedom when the scrubbing people or the washing up people or the cooks might have, oh, sorry about freedom, we want our freedom. No, then go to bed and then have the big grandiloquent ideas. In 1791, 2 years after the French Revolution, the slaves of the island of San Domingo, Haiti, heard from the grapevine that their home country, of course the country that owned them, France, had proclaimed liberté, égalité, fraternity. And what did the slaves do? They revolted and declared their freedom. What did the French Revolutionary government do? Sent soldiers out there to suppress the revolution. Yes, it's all right, freedom is okay for the salon classes back in France, but we don't want the slaves doing no work, do we? The slaves actually defeated the soldiers, and eventually it led to the first Black Republic in San Domingo, or what became Haiti. But to me it brings out wonderfully the hypocrisy of this Enlightenment ways of thinking. We have the grand ideas for the human race, but let somebody low down in society start taking some initiative and you try to stamp on it. That's what I think of a lot of idealism. But then other people really did things. Well, William Wilberforce and his long tradition of campaigning against slavery, which finally came to fruition, the slave trade in 1807. The first real mass movement in this country that began in the mid-1780s and took 2 decades to come to fruition. Changing the way in which people thought about the sugar they put in their tea or the treacle they put in their bread. This is not just coming in pots into Bristol. It's the product of people who've been captured against their will, often by other African kings, sold to shipwrights, taken over, forced to cultivate this stuff, and are in utter abject slavery. It struck a chord, and where it struck a chord most powerfully, but amongst Methodists, religious people, and evangelicals, who somehow right away realised there's something quite barbarous and unacceptable in this. And it went right through society. From the Earl of Manchester at the top, who was himself one of the warm supporters of Wilberforce, Admiral Malcolm, one of Nelson's, Admiral Barham, who was one of Nelson's great friends, one of the strategists of the Battle of Trafalgar, he supported it as well. And also to right through society. Petitions, the first big mass petitions, signed by shoemakers, factory hands, and whatever. Thomas Clarkson, the Reverend Thomas Clarkson, in Deacon's Orders of the Church of England, travelled the length and breadth of England for 30 years, arguing and preaching against the slave trade. And on one occasion, he preached in Manchester Collegiate Church, now Manchester Cathedral. And he says, as he stood there, not only was a massive sea of faces in this cathedral, but around the pulpit was a whole group of black men and women, who themselves were escaped slaves and now enjoyed freedom, living in England. Now, this has not a jot or tittle to do with liberté, égalité, and fraternity. It comes from the Christian gospel, and that's what finally fired it. The improvement later of better conditions in factories and mines. Shaftesbury, himself a devout Christian evangelical. Elizabeth Fry, prison reform, herself a devout Quaker. Women beginning to get into the movement also, from the Quaker tradition of men and women together. And finally, I would say, down to people like General Booth of the Salvation Army. I greatly admire the Salvation Army. And in the 1860s, he recognised that, yes, although we have the charities and all the rest of it, what about those really at the bottom? The starving, the prostitutes, the beggars, the drunkards, get down to them, because that's what Jesus did. And of course, it gets to the whole idea of actually helping the very lowest of the low and transforming them. Now, I have a story about the Salvation Army told to me by my grandparents when I was, well, I happened for a very, very long day of travel. Both of my grandparents were born in the early 1890s and died in the 1980s. And this is from industrial Manchester. And a fairly, hard-working, rough factory town. And grandfather used to tell a story of a local thug, yobbo, what we might now call social misfit, who was known as Cock Greg. Cock, of course, was a nickname for a man who really liked to good Cock so-and-so. And Cock Greg partly attended an open-air Salvation Army meeting in the street in Pendlebury in Lancashire, and the brass band and all the rest of it, and was converted, and his life transformed. But with the usual kind of earthy language you would expect in those circles that would have caused blushes in a salon in Paris. He said the Lord had touched him, and he was so full of joy, he could burst a bloody drum. Now, this is what fascinates me, what touches real reforms, what really changes people's lives, not just high theory. The Enlightenment was wonderful for high theory, but it did put a crust on a single table. That's another myth we have to deal with. Lastly, on the 30th of June 1860, Wilberforce and Huxley have a great, widely publicised set-piece debate in the newly opened museum in Oxford, part of a meeting of the British Association for the History of Science, the same thing that Sedgwick and Buckland and others addressed great crowds to. Now, this is the image you always get, and it's one, oddly enough and appallingly, always perpetuated on TV docudramas. Young Huxley, grave, clean-shaven, all the rest of it. Sam Wilberforce, doddering old fool, bishop, Bible punching, I don't know, all of this kind of nonsense. Let's get the dramatis personae right for a start. Wilberforce in 1860 was 55 years old. He had a first in mathematics from Oriel College in Oxford. He was the son of William Wilberforce, the great abolitionist, a nationally famous family. He'd been Dean of Westminster before he became Bishop of Oxford. And he was famous as a wit, a controversialist, an arguer. He had many, many scientific friends. I found my working many years ago on the diaries of Sir John Herschel, the astronomer. At one occasion, he was at the Athenaeum dining, and next to my Lord of Oxford, Sam Wilberforce. And Wilberforce told him a story about, I suppose you would call it, well, what had happened at the time. Wilberforce's son, very young man, was a midshipman in the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean. And one day, Sir Wilberforce was saying to Herschel, I suddenly became deeply anxious for no reason about my son. I knew it was at sea. What I did was to write down the date, the time, all the rest of it. Some time later, I heard from my son, recovering in the sick berth of his ship. He'd been supervising the stowing of some barrels in the hold of his ship. The ship had lurched, a barrel had fallen, and poor little young Wilberforce had to have a couple of toes amputated. But it was at the same time as Dad's warrior. And the bishop tells us to Herschel in conversation at dinner as a curious sort of piece of coincidence. He's also a great friend, of course, of Sir Richard Owen, the great anatomist, the keeper of the Hunterian Museum in London, surgeon, Anglican anatomist. And so hang on, he's moving in scientific circles. And then, as part of one article I was writing about the debate, which I think may be well called Monkeying Around with History, that was the deliberate title, Monkeying Around with History, I pointed this out, that researching the article one day, I suddenly thought, I'll ring up the Royal Society archivist, Keith Moore, and I thought, well, and say, does the name Samuel Wilberforce ring a bell? They said, well, of course he does, yes, so be Sam of Oxford. And I said, would you just mind checking what connections he had with the Royal Society? Well, on the 15th of December 1845 was the elected FRS. So so-called backward Sophie Sam Wilberforce was already an FRS of 15 years standing at the so-called debate in 1860. He had scientific friends, a first in mathematics, and what drew the crowd was Sam's famous ability as an entertaining public speaker. He packed in 700 people, it was estimated, to a hall intended to hold 350. Now the so-called exchange with Huxley about monkeys and grandmothers. We're always talking about what's the context in which this happens. Well, it's this. Before the bishop spoke, there had been a long, literally catcall-inducing address of about 1 hour by Dr. John Draper, an English-American astronomer, staunch atheist, and about atheism and positivism and reductionism and so on. And although, in fact, Draper had been born and bred in St. Helens in Lancashire, he'd gone to America as a young man, and we clearly picked up a very strong southern accent. And we are told that every time he spoke of the word the man and the monkey, it was the man and the monkey. And every time he said monkey, the undergraduates who were present would start making gibbering noises and scratching and catcalling. It was boring and silly. Sam then takes the floor, the real, absolute classic speaker. House of Lords, churches, lecture platforms. Sam could find anybody in his hand. And he had them rolling in the irons. And then, of course, he sees his face later. When he was at that this high of the audience, he turns round to Huxley, of course, and says, "Is it from your mother or your grandfather that you're descended from the apes?" But then the audience burst out into howls of laughter. The noise was too much to hear what he next said. And we're told this from a person's reminiscences. He realised it was not proper for one gentleman to suggest that another gentleman's grandmother was a monkey, especially in front of an audience. And so it was said that he then said these words: "I am sorry, I do not wish to hurt the professor's feelings." He apologised, I've just gone too far, and I pulled back. But that, of course, is not remembered in the so-called legendary story. How do we know about this debate? Largely from the 20th century. When Darwin's papers were published, or Darwin's Life and Letters in, I think it was 1897, Huxley's about 10 years later, Joseph Dalton Hooker's in 1918, all of whom were there. All mentioned this so-called great monumental clash. The only people who record very much about it are Darwin's close friends. Balfour Stewart, a Scottish physicist who happened to be in the audience, happened to mention, I think the bishop came off best. And various others mentioned that this was not a great corselet, it was an exchange, a witty exchange. Yet it's the Huxley family who largely engineered the great debate in the 20th century. And I'll tell you where, if you want to read the real classic version of it, Irving's Apes, Angels and Victorians, 1956. 96 years after the incident, where the definitive version that influences TV programmes and popular legendary history is finally crafted together. You look for it elsewhere with failure. Now, where did I put this to the acid test as a historian? John W. Draper, who allegedly gave a great speech before the bishop and was definitely at the meeting. In 1874, Draper published in the United States a book with a title which gives you absolutely no doubt of where he comes from. It was a history of the warfare of science and Christianity. You can't be more explicit than that. The warfare of science and Christianity. And he has all sorts of tales about conflict, which of course are drawn from the school I've been mentioning. Yet I looked in detail, carefully through that book. There isn't a single mention of the great debate of 1860. And for crying out loud, the man must have been sat in the front row listening to it. If it was so monumental, why doesn't he describe it in glowing detail as another example of the church's ignorance and narrowness? It ain't there. Now, this shows to me that the debate of 1860 was what I call an ephemeral flash in the pan. And it took place, it was a debate, yes. But we also too are familiar with the four pictures of various people at the debate. Darwin, Actually, was not present at the debate, but he was actually showing his bit. He was at Kidbrook Grove having a hydropathic cure at the time for his neuralgia. Huxley, the bishop, and Richard Owen, the anatomist, all shown as present in most popular publications. There's Soapy Sam like this in his bishop's lawn sleeves, and there are the others telling very, very primly, ah yes, these are the men who were drawn at that debate. Were they heck? I've been through Vanity Fair, the magazine from which they come. Charles Pellegrini was the artist who called himself Ache, the nickname of the artist. The earliest of those cartoons was 1869, a picture of Wilberforce. And then the others for Darwin. Notice the picture of Darwin in the popular cartoons of the debate. The white beard, very, very thin man, legs crossed in a chair. Hang on, look at the photograph of Darwin for 1860. He's clean shaven, and his hair's still dark. He's suddenly sprouted on a white beard overnight. The Darwin picture comes from 1874, from Vanity Fair. And the pictures too of Owen and also Huxley come from much, much later. You look at the portrait of Huxley in the Vanity Fair pictures. Standing there like that, with a pince-nez on his nose, 50, 55. He was 35 at the time. He was a young man at the time, and he's distinctly middle-aged on the famous portrait. Always look at portraits, they tell you a great deal. And so what has happened? Those pictures have been engineered into a group by modern copy editors with agendas. But also look up the 1869 Vanity Fair, which has Wilberforce. All of these pictures, I may say, were part of a series done by Vanity Fair called Men of the Day. And these include scientists, cricketers, generals, General Gordon some years later, the big men of the day, bishops, judges, the lot. They had nothing to do with 1860. But then, read the text that goes along with Sam Wilberforce's picture. And it says, he's one of the most entertaining men in London. At one point it says, should the Church of England be disestablished tomorrow, Dr. Wilberforce would never lack for dining tables at which to eat. He was such a social lion that everybody would want to feed him and look after him. Ladies liked him particularly. He'd been a widower for 30-odd years, well, nearly 30 years by that time. And the whole idea, he's a social lion, he's a wit, he's a man of enormous learning, he's the catch for any West End dinner party. Not some bubbling old fool who's past it. This is the real man himself. So really, what I say is be very careful when you read and you go over some of the material that is written about the iconic clashes in science and religion. Finally, just let me say about 1860. I have scoured the papers of the day for accounts of that debate. There are hardly any references at all. Only two national papers are very quick mentions, and they're not about the debate, they're about the British Association in Oxford. The only journal that I have actually found that mentions the so-called debate itself was the Oxford local rag, Jackson's Oxford Journal, 7th of July, 1860. It was a Saturday weekly. The debate was on a Saturday, reported the following Saturday. And it says, the bishop said this: he found Mr. Darwin's theory unphilosophical, unscientific. That Mr. Darwin had provided no examples of one creature turning into another creature. In other words, it was a speculation. That is Wilberforce's argument. It has nothing to do with religion. Bearing in mind this man has a first in mathematics, he's in an FRS, in a scientific culture which equated truth with mathematical rigour and experimental technique. And as far as he's concerned, Charles Darwin, nice gentleman as he was, nobody's denying that, had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. that is the nearest I have come across to what was actually said in that meeting. And like I say, religion doesn't even get a nosing. So I could talk on for a considerable amount of time longer, but I won't do that. But it's been a great pleasure to speak to you, and just bearing in mind, oh yes, finally Sophie's son, nicknamed Sophie's son. We get the popular idea of this old, frothing old windbag. The word soapy has changed meaning in 140 years. In 1860, it meant what we might now call smooth or sophisticated. It was more like sophisticated Sam rather than soapy Sam. And Sam liked being called soapy Sam for obvious reasons. And to give you some indication about his self-deprecating wit, I think I may say of which Huxley was totally, utterly and absolutely bereft of self-deprecating wit. He said this on one occasion: "Yes, I'm often in hot water, but I always emerge with my hands clean." Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure that's raised some questions. We're going to actually just go till 25 after and have a little 5-minute break. And I'm going to ask our speaker to repeat the question, because some people asked us to do that. Well, or I'll repeat the question when they come.
Yes, yes.
The audience would like us to repeat the question when it's been asked, okay? So
Yeah,
I can do that.
I understand.
Yeah,
I can do it.
okay.
Yes, also, I don't have the best hearing, but actually, since I was last year, I've got a hearing aid, so I hear
Yes.
better. Yes.
Okay, I might help out on that. So first question, please. Yes, so who would like to ask about this vast period that we've just been thinking about?
Yes,
please, yes.
It seems to me that the problem is not only in England and America, but in France. Could you just tell us a bit about what's happening in France?
Well, if you mean this 18th century, this
Can I
was-
repeat the question?
Yes, I mean,
repeat the
oh, yes.
question, yes, yes.
The lady asked the question, it's not just an English problem, it's also clearly there in France as well, with the relationship to the revolution. Much of the argument, I think, comes after the revolution, where they start to see the so-called Enlightenment in the ideas of what had gone on before, and the so-called getting rid of the church, which physically happens in 1791. Now, what you begin to find here is the emergence, too, of an early form of religion without God, of which calls positivism. Bearing in mind, most of the figures of the so-called Enlightenment were not atheists. Most of them, like Voltaire and Diderot and so on, were deists. They would have seen God as the creator, the universe had laws, Newton's laws were created by the great unchanging God, so they would have no problem with God. What they would have had the problem with is the idea of God sending his son to the earth. They would have problem with Christianity and theism. But what you start to get, though, with Comte is the rubbishing of the lot. That this is part of a backward way of thinking. Only scientific knowledge is true. Experimentation, mathematics is true. And Comte's movement, which can be called positivism, actually grows rapidly in France. They have temples of science. They invent literally a religion without God. Temples of science. They even write poems and sing hymns about science and about chemical experiments and things like that. So France drives it to some degree. On the other hand, after 1815, the French Catholic Church, and even under Napoleon, the French Catholic Church begins to reform and still maintains a very, very powerful intellectual body within French society. So you do have a lot of very influential French Catholics, but it's the secularists who really start to take the lead. The ideas of Comte are translated into English. They're read in America, and they create ideas about the adaptability, the way in which law in nature, borrowed from Newton and so on, carry on to perfection. And they're taken on by people in some ways like Max Weber in the latter part of the 19th century. You can see their connection to people like Sigmund Freud in the early part of the 20th century. Religion is an international neurosis. The idea, therefore, that anybody who believes in the transcendent must be mad. So yes, France has this, but in France in its day, or Catholic Europe in its day, Spain, I'm thinking especially, there was no shortage of very serious, either ordained or lay scientists. The Abbé Nollet late 18th century, famous experimenter with electricity. Luigi Galvani, who was a lay doctor in Italy, devout Catholic, early work on the structure of the brain and the nervous ganglia of the brain. And then, one thing I hadn't been aware of until some years ago, I was invited to give a lecture at the Royal Observatory in Madrid, Observatorio della Reale, and I was taken on the day after the lecture to the old warehouse in what had been formerly Madrid goods yards, railway goods yards. And there were boxes and boxes and boxes of crates. These were instruments brought back from the New World, used by Spanish Jesuits in all forms of studies: geology, geography, chemistry, geophysics. And this was incredible. Spanish Jesuit scientists in Latin America. Maximilian Hell, the famous Austrian Jesuit, goes to North Cape to observe the transit of Venus in 1769. Jesuits working in France are measuring the length of the standard pendulum in the 1730s and 1740s, and then going to South America to compare readings in France at about 48 degrees north with readings on the Earth's equator, ordered by Jesuits, or some Dominicans as well. Another group of men I've worked on a lot, including Frenchmen, Jesuits in China. When you bear in mind that He, I think that's the correct pronunciation, He, who was the Emperor of China 1666 to 1718, he was a little boy when he became Emperor, was seriously interested not only in Western science, but also in Christianity. He loved discussions with Ferdinand Verbiest and Adam Schall von Baer. What a wonderful name, an Austrian Jesuit, Adam Schall von Baer, about Christianity. And I've often thought, considering the nature of that empire, had He publicly accepted Christianity in, let's say, 1685, how the history of the world would have been different. But these are French, Spanish, Austrian, Italian, German Jesuits. They're all deeply devout now, at the very height of the so-called Enlightenment, travelling the world, lecturing in European universities, and not the only ones. And you have others like Abbe Nole, who was not a Jesuit, he was just a minor priest, and no problem at all. So we often have to be careful we don't take the whole idea of the Enlightenment and utterly blow it beyond description. Because most people in France either were what we would call straight Trinitarian Catholics, or else deists. The number of people who were active unbelievers, like the Baron de Holbach and Georges Lamartre, not of course Lamartre, the famous 20th century figure, Lamartre, who was nicknamed the King's Atheist when he was in Berlin with Frederick II. These people are a tiny minority. And of course, as I emphasised in this correspondence, in reality, most of Europe was seriously Christian. And the French Revolution and those after the French Revolution tried to re-engineer our perspective, but get back to their world, not the later imaginary world. It's a very different terrain. So yes, France is a fascinating place to look.
Good, thank you. Another question. Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
yes.
Who is actually doing this re-engineering?
So
Who is doing the re-engineering?
that's a very good point. Who is doing this re-engineering? I think it comes to some degree out of big philosophical interpretations of history, which really begin in a big way in the middle and the late 19th century. I think Marx, and I'm not saying Marx is doing this deliberately as such, but Marx in 1866 with Das Kapital is not just about economics, it's about the whole nature of human relationship and how society works. He has the idea that you have great ages of conflicts, revolutions, and old, out-of-date cultures get overridden by new dynamic cultures, so you have feudalism overtaken by capitalism in the Renaissance, the idea of the Protestant work ethic. Then after that, nowadays we will have communism. So it's a very cataclysmic school of historical thinkers. Likewise, Karl Weber, born in 1861, very active in the late 19th, early 20th century. Weber's idea again, which is cataclysm-based. that progress is the escape from superstition to empirical knowledge. That's another style of thinking. Sigmund Freud, and his ideas that neurosis was essentially germane to the human condition, and the profoundest neurosis was belief in God. And you imagine the damage that does to God knows how many people, child psychiatrists and people like that. And when you look at the scholarly world, I mean, I know this when I was an undergraduate in the late 60s, early 70s, reading the then state-of-the-art books. And you suddenly smell Weberian ideas, you smell the idea of the scientific revolution. Thomas Kuhn, who invented the term in 1938, the scientific revolution. Thomas Kuhn, K-U-H-N, was himself a Marxist historian, sociologist, and looking at, as it were, how we climb up Mount Improbable, and we do this by climbing on the backs of defunct intellectual generations, such as those who believed in God, and things like that. So that's where it comes from. And so it then gets into a culture. The universities have always been famous for their avant-garde thinking. So much avant-garde thinking by the 1930s, 40s, especially with the rise of Stalin, and people's idea of, with the nickname Uncle Joe, who was making Russia out of the barbarism of Christian Tsardom and bringing it into the truth of communism, before his mass murders came to be known, that Uncle Joe was spoken of affectionately, all feeds this frontline. So now history is changing, and at last we're on top of all of this old-fashioned religious backwardness. And it's this roller coaster, and I've been fascinated by following its traits. And it's still with us in certain circles of this day. But a lot of modern scholars are now, irrespective of their religious beliefs, and they're beginning to smell serious rats in this. And a lot of modern scholarship in the history of science is not grand cultural interpretations. It's much more concerned with specific studies, detailed study of documents and material of that sort. So it comes out of a growing flood tide of, I suppose you might broadly call it, late 19th, early 20th century sociological theory. Yes, sir?
Yes.
I would like to follow up on that question. Thomas Huxley told Charles Darwin he would use this theory of evolution against the Church of England. Could you say something about the relationship between the Royal Society and the Church at that time and what it's like today?
Yes, certainly. Let's put it this way. Huxley was not an atheist. Tom Huxley was not an atheist. He himself coined, I understand it, but he coined the term agnostic. I don't know. And two things. Huxley, as the term I use, don't think of Huxley as Richard Dawkins in a frock coat. As utterly different kinds of men altogether. Huxley is a vastly more sophisticated thinker than Dawkins, and is deeply concerned with what he uses crises in his society. He is brought up, he's a son of a schoolmaster, a good Anglican education. He loses part of his faith at medical school and so on, but never, as far as we can tell, some kind of belief in God. I'm not quite sure, but Darwin too mentions the Creator many times in The Origin of Species as a beginning point. Then, when Darwin dies in 1883, in fact, Huxley has a lot of friends in the church, including a pal who happens to be a canon of Westminster. This is what partly makes it possible for Darwin to be buried in the Abbey. And when Huxley was being, as a very increasing big man, big public figure, I suppose he's just a geologist, and he's being asked by this Royal Commissioner, that Royal Commissioner, whatever, and one of these was the beginning of state education after 1870. What should be on the curriculum in these new state schools paid for out of taxpayers' money to educate the working classes? Huxley believed children should learn their Bibles. They should learn Christian morality. The idea being that no matter what he thought about religious transcendence, it was the best morality in the world. If you lived like a Christian, no matter if you were an atheist, you'd be better in your behaviour. And Christianity has made the world we live in critiques of Christian history. So yes, Huxley, Darwin, is quite happy with David and Goliath and the flood and Adam and Eve. It was finished. And so there's not that sort of horror against the church. And he's not especially anti-church. What he's against is what he sees as clerical establishment. And there's a difference here. What is taking place, and I discussed this on my article, Aping Our Ancestors, which I think was sent on, and there's a copy to have a look at. What happens between 1850 and 1920 is the whole structure of the scientific profession changes. Away from being predominantly man either A, gentlemen in holy orders, or B, rich private gentlemen, to whom university professors were, on the whole, a very small numerical number. By 1920, science has professionalized for it. In other words, men holding chairs with explicit scientific training and all the rest of it. Now, Huxley and people like William Tyndall and Belfast and others are drivers of that movement towards scientific professionalism. Now, what this tends to mean is that when Huxley is sometimes anti-church, he's not against the CME per se or against Christianity. Yes, he didn't accept it. Yes, it was a civilizing force in society. He didn't like clergymen controlling all the top jobs. That was basically it. And it was to bring in more lay people into the professions rather than clerical domination. But the reason, of course, why the church had dominated for so long is they had been the best educated members of society. They were most familiar. They were, in fact, the most leisured as well, and the most independent. You know, you are rector of Rat Hole in the Water, 1,000 a year. You've got 3 curates, lovely big rectory. Keep your coach and carriages and gigs and all the rest of it. And, well, you can think great thoughts. Well, I'm interested in science. I'll buy a really fine telescope and start doing some real scientific reports and interesting rocks around here. I'll start digging up the land and start reporting to the Geological Society. Oh, my friends have proposed me for an FRS. Isn't that lovely? And so that was the structure of the profession. What Huxley is saying, you want more men who are not like that, who are actually full-scale at the scientific coalface. And I actually like that word, because in a way I'm closer to it myself. I wonder what I call grand amateurs. Grand, because they addressed the great intellectual issues of the day. Amateur, from a term they used about themselves, from the Latin word to love. I love science. So there would be science for love and not for profit. I love that word, and I would love to have been in 1840, let's say, rector of Rathole on the Water and an FRS and all the rest of it. Really tremendous life, tremendous. And dining at the Athenaeum and all the rest of it. But Huxley didn't see that. Huxley saw science much more as we see it. And that was where his position really came from.
Well, we're in the wrong century, I can see that. I think we have more chance for questions later on because of the panel discussion. I think what we're going to do now is, first of all, thank Alan very much for a really fascinating talk.